So today we're going to talk about Bramante and Raphael. And I've mentioned Bramante already to you because he's the one Michelangelo blames for uh, making Julius change his mind about the project for his tomb and making Michelangelo do the Sistine Chapel. Two things that brought a great deal of displeasure to Michelangelo. Bramante's career, as I told you, it started out in Urbino, which is why Julius II was especially eager to bring him to Rome. But before he makes his way to Rome, he ends up in Milan working for the Duke of Milan, the Sforza Duke, at the same time that Leonardo was working there. So we actually know that Bramante and Leonardo knew each other and were exchanging ideas about architecture and thinking about new ways that architecture should look and function, especially in regards to church architecture. There was a big project going on in Milan, which was the building of the Cathedral of Milan. It had been going on for some time. And Bramante and Leonardo try to argue that they should move away from the Gothic style that the cathedral was being built in and instead adopt a new Renaissance vocabulary, classicizing vocabulary for the architecture. And we have sketches that both Bramante and Leonardo do from this period, and it really shows their kind of conversations, interactions with each other as they're talking about architecture. Something that they are both interested in, and we can especially see this as Bramante's career develops as an architect, is using what they viewed as perfect geometrical shapes to be the basis of the architecture. And that especially meant for them circles and squares. And they saw those shapes, especially the circle, as being symbolic of the divine, the perfection, the infinity of the divine. And so Bramante, in his church architecture, really tries to convince his patrons to use these centrally planned churches and to build these centrally planned churches instead of the more traditional basilica plan or longitudinal plan churches that have one arm that's longer of a cross, essentially, or a rectangular. What Bramante wanted to urge patrons to do is either do like an octagonal or circular or square ground plan, which would make the church centrally planned. The reason there was resistance to that is that it's hard to give that sense of direction towards the high altar if the church is centrally planned. If it's longitudinally planned, you understand that you go down the long nave towards the apse into the altar. If it's centrally planned, you could lose that focus. And so patrons show a resistance to taking on these new forms, even if they may like the symbology of those forms. They worry about its practicality. We see Bramante dealing with this issue as he does this project that you're seeing here, which is the Church of Santa Maria presso San Satiro in Milan. And this project required the addition onto a previous structure. And if I can, I'll show you what that structure looked like. Here we go. So there was this structure here in the building, and Bramante is very much constricted by the space that he has to build on to, but wants to use these new kinds of spaces, and you can see it's this circular plan, in fact, that he adds on here. But there is the concern about directionality in the church, and so what we see him doing in this space, in this centrally planned space, is to make an illusion. So this is an optical illusion that he's created here to make it look like there's an arm of the church wall that extends back and forms this traditional space of the apse end of the church, which is where the high altar would be placed. What is hard to understand when you're looking at this point of view here is that you're placed exactly where Bramante wanted you to be placed, so this illusion completely works for you. But the reality is, this is only about 2 feet deep, this wall, if that. I think it's actually even less than that. And so it's practically flat. And this is purely done using 1-point perspective and making these coffers get smaller to make it look like they're receding into space, and doing the same kind of things, decreasing the space and volume as you move to make it look like it's, going back in depth, when in actuality it's not. But what that did was mimic the functionality of the longitudinally planned church without breaking from that centrally planned structure that Bramante wanted to do. So I want to clarify a little bit, and I thought I could do that with some more images. So forgive me, I'm just pulling these up online as I go. But just to show you, this is a cross section of the church, and basically what Bramante was constrained by was this site. There were some wall spaces that couldn't be moved. There were palaces that were nearby that couldn't be moved. And in that image that I showed you previously, you're seeing it from this angle. And there was a tower here that was already in place. So Bramante's task is to design this church, and you have somewhat of an extended nave space, but primarily, what you're seeing here is this T-shape, but a really truncated kind of a space that he's having to work with here. And what he ends up doing is really creating the sense of a centrally planned building, especially in this area of the crossing where this arm meets this arm, right? But he uses this illusionism in this space so that that it looks like it extends beyond, right, and makes it perfectly symmetrical and balanced as one would expect it to. And then in this area, he's able to add on to this space and create this perfectly centrally planned structure, and that is the martyrium space. So it's where the remains of the saints are buried. So just to show you exactly what this illusion looks like, let me see what I can. So this is pretty much the view I showed you before. So it looks like it's, you have this perfect recession into space. You really get the sense that it continues beyond as you would expect it to. But if you look at this from the side, you can see it's actually totally shallow and fictive. So Bramante had a very fixed point of view that he wanted you to see this from. I'm just seeing if there's anything else particularly useful here. Some of these just make it a little more confusing perhaps, but anyway, I think you get the point that, here's a good one, that it's actually quite shallow, right? So hello. So you actually need to be right, oh good, sorry about that. So you actually need to be right at this perfect spot. So it's somewhat limited in its illusionism, right? And that's a little problematic. But it was an ingenious solution considering the restraints of this site, and clearly inspired Bramante to think about, if there were different ways that you could manage something that looks centrally planned but still allowed you that longitudinal emphasis and direction towards the high altar. And then project that we know Bramante does very early on in his time in Rome, and perhaps it's the project that brought him to Rome, I think that's quite likely actually, is this project. And this is the so-called Tempietto, or Little Temple, at the site of the Church of San Pietro in Montorio, which is right up the hill from the Vatican. And it's a monument that marks the spot where St. Peter was crucified. So they crucified St. Peter here, and then they took his body down the hill and buried it at the site where the Church of St. Peter's is. So this little structure, this tempietto, was not meant to be a functional space for the liturgy. It's not, it's truly just a monument to mark a spot. And because of that lack of need for traditional kind of direction and such in the church, because this is just a monument, Bramante was able to really try out his ideas about a centrally planned structure. The patrons for this little temple were Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the monarchs that sent Columbus on his way to discover the New World, so to speak, which is kind of an interesting thing. The Spanish crown wanted to leave their mark in Rome. Ferdinand and Isabella were absolute defenders of the faith and had kicked out at this point the Moors from southern Spain, and were really driving out any heretic, or who they saw as heretics, in the Iberian Peninsula, at least in the part that they ruled over. And so they wanted to leave their mark in Rome as well, and negotiated a bit so that they could be the ones to erect this monument. So what we see here is a perfectly circular structure, and it's extremely classicizing. You've got, columns that go all the way around the structure. You've got triglyphs and metopes, and in fact this is the Doric order. So Doric order columns and column capitals, and then triglyphs and metopes. All right, so as I was saying, triglyphs and metopes, and there are little sculptures in the metopes, and those are actually, those sculptures there are, instead of the pagan symbology that one would usually find in the metopes of an ancient Greek or Roman building, here instead those are implements of the liturgy. So there will be the paten that holds the bread, there will be the chalice for the wine, and so forth. On the upper story there's this balustrade, and then you have this sort of mezzanine level with these niches that alternate between square and curved, and then you have it topped by a dome, which is of course classicizing, and there was a great inspiration for doing a domed structure in Rome, which was the building of the Pantheon. So Bramante clearly is looking around Rome. There were monuments that were very similar to this, still intact in Rome. And even there was an early Christian tradition of using these kind of small round buildings to mark sites of martyrium. So even, the form of the building as a small circular building had an early Christian precedent, and that made a lot of sense for a building that was, going to be placed on the site of St. Peter's martyrdom. So there are connections to the early Christianity, but also to the architectural traditions of Greece and Rome. So it really, for Bramante, was just the perfect opportunity to meld those traditions together and bring them, as an updated Renaissance architectural form. Here is one of those buildings. This is in Tivoli, but just gives you a sense of what some of these ancient structures that were in Tivoli, which is not far from Rome, but also in Rome itself, that must have been sources of inspiration for Bramante as he designed the Tempietto. You can see this one actually has a running frieze and a Corinthian style column capitals, but it's a rounded form. So there were these important precedents. Another precedent, this one, the Mausoleum of Costanza, the Church of Santa Costanza, which is a centrally planned building. It's round and has the Mausoleum of Costanza, so actually has the remains of Costanza in it. And, you know, either these rounded buildings were used as martyrium, as I just told you about with the Tempietto, but also this rounded form like this could be used for mausolea. And at the original site of the Church of St. Peter's, there was a round building like this that marked the site where St. Peter's remains were found. So, you know, that would have been an obvious source of inspiration for Bramante. So after the Tempietto project, Bramante has this conversation with Julius about how he can best leave a mark on history, and convinces Julius that what he really ought to do is to rebuild the Church of St. Peter's. There had been some discussions in the course of the 15th century about whether they should just kind of try to restore what they could of the early Christian building built during the reign of Constantine, or if they should just start from scratch. And Bramante at least gives a go at suggesting that the old church should be knocked down, and instead they should make a centrally planned structure. And we have this ground plan that Bramante conceived of. This is actually by Bramante, this plan. And what we see here is half of the plan. And what the idea would be is that this would be exactly mirrored on the other side. And so you would have this cube with some areas that kind of jut out, and that's where altar spaces would be, right? And then you've got all of these subsidiary structures within that could help give you some direction down towards the altars, and deal with that problematic part of having a centrally planned building. But, you know, there are issues with that, as I've mentioned, and ultimately the design that Bramante comes up with is using in part that centrally planned structure that we just saw the design for, but then extending it back so that you have a longer longitudinal plan. It was probably less his idea than it was the concern of the popes to give that directionality that was needed. That plan of Bramante's seems to have influenced the painter Raphael. Raphael and Bramante were friends. They're coming from the same town. And again, same with Julius. And Raphael is given a commission. He starts it a year after Michelangelo starts the Sistine Chapel ceiling. The commission is for the wall paintings for the apartments of the Pope. These are the personal apartments of the Pope. And Raphael here in this space, he first does this room called the Stanza della Segnatura. This is a room that traditionally had been used as a space where the Pope signs documents. So segnatura means signature. And it probably held, different books in here about the church laws and so forth that the Pope could have consulted as he was making decisions about church doctrine. The four walls of this space were painted, and we see Raphael here using, we think, that plan of Bramante's for the Church of St. Peter's, that plan we saw with the centralized structure. And Raphael incorporates it here as this magnificent space, very classicizing, where we have the meeting of philosophers and other mathematicians, great men of learning from all different spheres. And we have here in the center Plato and Aristotle, and over here we have Euclid. There's just smatterings of men of learning from the classical world all over. And the structure here, really speaks to the ideas of Bramante's architectural aesthetic, that things are monumental, but with this real simplicity about them. And Bramante's clearly inspired by the monuments of ancient Rome around that were, by this point, mostly stripped of their original ornament, and Bramante sees it as the way things looked in the ancient Roman period. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail about the room here. Sorry, I got to sneeze. Because I have, as you know, assigned you to look at the Vatican website, which has a virtual tour of this room and gives a great overview of what the program of the room is. This is the wall that illustrates philosophy and discussion of thought. In this case, we're certainly supposed to make the association between the golden age of the classical era, and that Julius II is bringing in a new classical age where the church will incorporate the ideas of these great men of learning of the past, but update them into this purely Christian context. One other aspect, though, that's fascinating about this particular scene is how it represents the status of art and artist in the beginning of the 16th century. Artists in the 14th and 15th centuries had been regarded as manual laborers, and I've mentioned this idea to you before. But what we see in this painting is that artists, contemporary artists, are being shown here in the guise of the great men of learning of the past, and this is quite a statement. For example, we believe that this figure here is in fact Leonardo, that this guy is in fact Michelangelo, that this person, who's Euclid actually here, is actually a portrait of Bramante, and then over here in the corner we have a portrait of Raphael. This inclusion, and we believe that there are actually many other artists that are included here that we just haven't been able to identify yet. But what is interesting about this inclusion is it really shows that art and artists are now being regarded as on par with the great men of learning of their time. And Raphael is really celebrating that here, and Julius absolutely must have given his permission for that to happen, which says a lot about Julius and his patronage and the way that he regarded art and artists, but more broadly, the way that artists were being esteemed in contemporary culture at this point. Raphael becomes appointed as the commissioner of antiquities in Rome. His knowledge about antiquity is so highly regarded that he is made to be the sort of conservator and the point man for information about Roman antiquity in particular, especially as various excavations start happening in this period and new works and monuments are uncovered, it's Raphael who would have been the point guy for that. Michelangelo, who we see here, is shown looking rather melancholic, which probably relates to his actual personality. But he is seen here drawing on this block. We believe that he's supposed to be Diogenes, but there's been some suggestion that this is just Michelangelo as Michelangelo, and this is Raphael's tribute to him. And that very well may be the case. We know that Raphael, Michelangelo is working on the Sistine Chapel right in these years, and we know that Raphael was, unlike most people, allowed to go in and see Michelangelo's work. And there is one point when Michelangelo is moving the scaffolding from point to point that Julius allows people in to see Michelangelo's progress. Michelangelo not happy about that, but anyway. And Raphael certainly would have seen it in that occasion, but we think he may have seen it along the way as well. And we think that this inclusion here of Michelangelo is meant to pay homage to him, but also, really illustrates it and kind of encapsulates what we know of Michelangelo's personality. And he was not nice to Raphael. He blamed Raphael for, this horrible event of having to do the Sistine Chapel ceiling and that sort of thing. So it's a difficult relationship there at best. But Raphael clearly admired Michelangelo, and when he sees the Sistine Chapel ceiling, it has a great impact on his art. And, this figure seems to be a little bit out of scale from these others. They're slightly smaller in scale than he is. And the idea is that maybe that figure was added on after Raphael had seen the ceiling and saw that Michelangelo's figures are getting larger and more monumental in their scale than they had been previously, and he's reacting to that here. This is a better image to give you a sense of the color. This whole space was restored just a few years ago with some scandal, actually. And in fact, I have to say, I saw this room after the last cleaning, and I absolutely think that they overcleaned it. It seems stripped away. There's clearly some areas of loss there that weren't there before, which is deeply unfortunate. But what you can see better in this image is that he's using that same colore cangiante that I pointed out that Michelangelo was using. And you can see how identifiable this figure is as Michelangelo, because he even has on Michelangelo's famous dog-skinned boots, which is disturbing, but that's Michelangelo. Here is Euclid and his students, and you see that he's drawing these perfect shapes, and we think that this is Bramante and relates to Bramante's approaches to architecture, as we've seen, are so based on perfect geometrical shapes, and the connection to Euclid would have been an obvious one for Raphael to make. And then here is the little inclusion of Raphael back here. He's actually behind this guy, who is Sodoma, who had first painted this space. And Raphael, the ceiling is still by Sodoma, and other areas that we know Sodoma actually completed, but Raphael was the one that took over the project. Here's a view of two of the other walls. This is the Disputa. This is a discussion that's taking place here about the the miracle of transubstantiation, whether this is in fact the host that's represented here is in fact the body of Christ, or if it's just representative of the body of Christ. And you can see this great gathering of theologians that are debating the actual state of the host here, the bread. In this upper sphere that's really delineated here is the heavenly realm, where you have Christ watching over this debate. But there's a real sense of calm here compared to all of this gesturing and discussion that's happening down here on earth. And that distinction is an important one. On this side, we have the representation of the three cardinal virtues, which is pretty typical imagery to see here. And as I said, these are further described, and their meanings are further described in the Vatican website, which you are to look at and do the short quiz on. Another view of the Disputa. You can see you have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the emanations of God, certainly a critical part of the Catholic faith, and at the moment of the liturgy of the Eucharist, they are invoked. Raphael does other apartments, some with help of a number of students that he starts to take on in this period. This is the Stanza dell'Eliodoro, or the Heliodorus room, and in it we see several different scenes. There's one on each wall, of course, and what you're seeing here is the Mass of Bolsena and the expulsion of Heliodorus. So we'll first look at this scene of the expulsion of Heliodorus, which we see here. So this is a story that comes from the book of Maccabees, and it's a story that tells of Heliodorus, who had been sent to steal the treasure of the Temple of Jerusalem, and he stopped from making off with the treasure by the entrance of heavenly soldiers, let's call them, that knock him down. And you can see one is on horseback, and then you've got these two kind of flying in here and knock him over, and there's the treasure as it spills out onto the ground. I have to point out before I move on that this figure, this partially reclining figure with a little container that has something spilling out, is absolutely after an ancient Roman sculpture of a river god that's shown in exactly the same way, and the container has water that spills out of it as the mouth of the river. Anyway, sorry. So that's the main scene that's taking place here. Included in here as an observer to what's happening is Julius II himself, who's being carried here on the papal bier, and he observes the scene, and it's thought that there's a reference here to the fact that in this moment Julius, as was often the case during his reign, is at battle, and in particular he is having, he's trying to protect the church, or so he says, from the potential invasions and loss of power and of treasury that these foreign states wish to impose on the papal states. And Julius instead is working hard to defend the integrity of the Papal States as its ruler. And so, he is watching over this scene, and this shows the divine will, that the papal treasury, in this case, be kept intact and be kept as part of the papacy, and the power that went along with it. You see in the very background here what appears to be a priest kneeling at an altar in prayer, and he's kneeling, asking for the intervention of God to stop the thief, which obviously happened. We believe this is yet another inclusion of Julius that Raphael has done, to show the pontiff's role, in, as this faithful proponent of the church and asking for the intervention of God, and then it's obviously he's working, by divine right, that God has bestowed on him to protect the church and such. I guess we could talk about this. Let's see if I have a better image there. Yeah, there we go. In another wall, we have the liberation of St. Peter from prison and the deliverance of St. Peter. This scene shows, it's a beautiful scene. It's this night scene, quite an unusual thing to see in the High Renaissance period. And what we see here is the imprisonment of St. Peter. He had been imprisoned in Rome, and St. Peter, of course, is the first pope, the one that Christ gives the authority of the church over to, and it makes obvious associations with the current papacy, and that's obviously significant. But what we see are soldiers that are meant to be guarding the jail cell where we find St. Peter, but an angel has obviously been able to get in there and liberates Peter, and we see him walking out in freedom as the soldiers here miraculously sleep, and he's led out by the angel. Again, it's this obvious parallels with Julius and how he sees himself as being both under siege and ruling by divine, carrying out the will of God in the way that he's doing things, and trying to maintain the will of God and the strength of the papacy as Christ had intended. On the other wall, hold on just a moment. On the other wall, which we saw here, there is the scene of the Mass at Bolsena. The scene that we're seeing here is an event that happened actually in the 13th century. A Bohemian priest who had doubted whether it was really the body of Christ in the consecrated host, the bread of the Eucharist, stopped doubting because the host actually started to bleed. And that's what we see is taking place here. We see Julius again included in the scene, and Julius is witness to this miracle that's taking place. The connection for Julius is an important one, however, because the cloth that had the blood from this bleeding host was a relic that was held in the church in Orvieto, which is in central Italy. And it's a church where Julius had stopped along the way, and he had prayed to this relic, in front of this relic, and asked for, divine intervention in a way. But, it was in this moment of battle with the Bolognese and with others as he's trying to defend the Papal States and also to take in more territory. And he goes and venerates this relic And as he is here, he hears about the success of this latest battle that his troops are embroiled in. And Julius credits the intervention of this relic and its miraculous powers to the successes that he heard about on that day. So again, these are stories that happened in the past, but Raphael is making the connection to Julius in important ways. Another scene that is included here is a scene that was probably planned from, certainly there was something planned for this wall, but it's actually not done until Julius II's successor. And his successor was Leo the 10th, sorry. And this scene shows us a scene that happened during the time of Leo the First, and so an early Christian pope, and shows us, obviously the name connection is an important one, and we see the new pope, Leo the 10th, depicted as he comes in on this white horse and sees this scene unfolding. The scene that he's observing is this moment when the Huns are starting their invasion, and Leo the First is able to quell the invasion because of the intervention of Peter and Paul, who we see flying in up here. This scene, like the other ones we've looked at, would have made, kind of reinforce that idea of the holy intervention that comes at the will of the Pope, and this whole idea of the defense of the Papal States. And it very well may be that this was planned as a scene from the very beginning, but that Leo the 10th had chosen the name, his papal name is Leo. No doubt he was eager to have this scene completed and include, in fact, his portrait, as we know this guy is. And it's under Leo's patronage that Raphael continues the other projects of the papal rooms and many other projects throughout Rome. He had a really good relationship with Leo. Leo, by the way, is a Medici Pope, and we'll be coming back to talk about him when we get back to talking about the Medici family. Raphael, as I said, worked for Leo in a number of instances, and this image is not a great one because it's quite dark compared to how the painting actually looks. But we see Leo, the Pope, here with his cardinals, Giulio de' Medici and Luigi de' Rossi. Giulio was the bastard child of Giuliano de' Medici, the guy that had been killed in the Pazzi conspiracy. And Giulio will go on to be Pope as well. He will be Clement VII, who we'll talk about later on. Raphael worked for patrons beyond the popes in Rome, and in fact, I did an amazing cycle here in this palace. This today is called the Villa della Farnesina, but in Raphael's time was owned by Agostino Chigi. Chigi was a banker. He was from Siena originally, and found money and fame and good times in the city of Rome, and set up house here and famously had just the best parties in Rome. And so this was a house that invited many, many visitors in, and he had lavish parties that took place in this space. Farnesina, I should explain, references a family that will buy this house later on, the Farnese family. But as I said, this was Chigi's household at the time. The walls of Palazzo Farnese or Villa della Farnesina, sorry.
All right.
So, um, sorry, so Chigi famously had lots of parties here, and Raphael, who I've already mentioned to you, was this beautiful young guy who everybody enjoyed the company of, had a mistress in this moment that he was very much in love with. And to such an extent that Vasari tells us that Chigi got really frustrated with Raphael because he just wanted to be with this woman all the time and wouldn't get any of the work done on this great fresco program that Chigi had commissioned from him. And so Chigi finally just had to get the woman to come and live with Raphael as he worked on these scenes so that he would get some work done. What Raphael did for Chigi was a series of frescoes that are the stories of the loves of the gods. And love is the major theme in all of the fresco program here. This worked out well for Raphael, as that's what he's most interested in this moment, but also for Chigi, who had a courtesan that he was very much in love with as well, Olympia, who probably was living with him in sin in this moment as well. So the scenes that we see here are, these beautiful gods and goddesses as they
You're a goddess.
interact in love. So we'll look at some examples of them. Here is a scene with Cupid and Psyche, and actually here we have Cupid and the three Graces. And here they are in all of their beauty. Obviously, Raphael's very interested in the beauty of the female beauty, of the female body, unlike how we've seen Michelangelo masculinizes the bodies of his women. Raphael certainly celebrates the feminine attributes of his female nudes. If you look closely, there's this garland with fruits and flowers of various sorts, and some of it has some kind of questionable sexual references in it that are kind of funny to look at, but I won't show you here. I can let you look those up on your own. In another room, another artist, Baldassare Peruzzi, did a fresco cycle that shows perspectives, and the perspectives are architectural illusions. It makes it look like there are these columns and that the walls, are not here, and instead it looks like you're just looking through a portico and see the landscape of Rome beyond, and it's all just fictive. It really shows Peruzzi's great ability at doing these kinds of optical illusions. Another view for you to see that. It's really quite convincing, even when you see them in person. It's pretty astounding. Another room that Raphael does for Chigi is this room, the Salon di Galatea, a room so named because of this scene of Galatea. But it is again a cycle about love and the joy of love, but also the potential dangers of love. So Galatea we see here with this whole cohort of sea nymphs as they are scooting away on this chariot led by dolphins. You see Cupid's a little, putti with bows and arrows shooting down around Galatea. because she is fleeing the love of Polyphemus, the Cyclops, who is here, and mournfully watches as she seeks to escape his love. So the dangers, the sad parts of unrequited love. Right? Compositionally, this is regarded as just, the perfect high Renaissance composition. You have the figure of Galatea centrally placed. You have a swirl of motion that is created in part by the gestures, and you can really see this kind of oval that enframes this central figure. That's echoed above as well with the placement of these putti, and everything is just framing the central figure, and it really acts in a way as to make the composition as clear as possible, to make the story as clear as possible, for the viewer to immediately hone in on who the most important figure was. And so, it's, and then the color patterning that we see, and the treatment of these beautiful bodies, these idealized forms, it's just the perfect high Renaissance composition. Oops. So one thing that is a sort of wonderful story about Kiji that really speaks to the kind of luxury and great sense of partying that took place here is that Kiji famously would have these huge dinner parties, and people of all of the great elite would come and party together there. And Kiji really liked to show off his wealth, and served all of the many courses of their dinners on gold plates, like pure gold. And he, after dinner was done, he would, instead of having the plates washed, he would throw them into the fireplace, much to the awe of the people eating with him, that he, was so rich that he didn't even have to worry about wasting the gold of the plates. It didn't matter. Instead of just having them washed and reuse them, he could just throw them away. Secretly, however, there was a net, like the fireplace just opened up, and there was a little net down at the bottom that would catch the plate, so that he actually was not burning these plates. He was keeping them, but it gave that illusion of the kind of luxury that he wished to give. All right, I think that's enough for now, and we'll come back and look at Michelangelo again, starting with our next class.